Good morning. Wishing everyone a happy and healthy 2025. It's Monday, January 6th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 458 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, I don't know about you, but I took a proper vacation. I caught up on my sleep. I read a couple of fiction books. That's pretty rare. And I even put my phone down for a few days, but it was only a matter of time before I would plug back in and follow the latest out of the Middle East. Here's the bottom line. Iran and Hezbollah are quiet. They're both licking their wounds after getting spanked by the Israelis in the fall of last year. Against all odds, Hamas appears to be recruiting again in Gaza. The Houthis keep firing ballistic missiles at Israel out of Yemen. Donald Trump is still warning that a hostage deal with Hamas needs to be made before he takes office. But a hostage deal is elusive, at least for now. Syria's new leaders still insist that they are moderates, even though we all know they are al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the death of Jimmy Carter had people sparring about the legacy of the former president and what he did or didn't do for the sake of peace in the Middle East. And speaking of Jimmy Carter, today's guest is Kenneth Stein. Ken's claim to fame is that he taught yours truly the history of the Middle East at Emory. Actually, that's not his claim to fame. Ken is a remarkable scholar who has forgotten more about the Middle East than I have ever learned. He actually worked with the Carter Center for many years, traveling with the former president and advising him on Middle East issues. Ken parted ways with Carter back in 2006 after Carter's anti-Israel rhetoric reached a fever pitch. We're going to talk to Ken about what happened back then, among other things, in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. The Houthis continue to fire ballistic missiles at Israel. After 15 months, Yemen could be the last hot front in this war. Iran's proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, are battered. The Assad regime is gone, and the Islamic Republic won't attack Israel with its air defenses down. Israel destroyed those back in October. So Iran continues to ply the Houthis with missiles to attack Israel from afar. Once again, the regime is fighting Israel to the last Arab. The Israeli Air Force is responding forcefully, conducting a number of successful long-distance strikes on Houthi assets, Houthi targets going boom, and Israeli aircraft returning without a scratch. Probably doesn't sound so bad, but let me explain why it's unsustainable. First, the Houthis are not deterred. They don't fear death or destruction. Second, the cost disparity of the Houthis firing Iranian ballistic missiles versus Israel shooting them down with million-dollar interceptors and then scrambling dozens of jets flying across the Arabian Peninsula and conducting pinpoint strikes, well, that's just not sustainable. Admittedly, those bombing runs are good practice for when Israel decides to strike Iran's nuclear program. Whenever the time comes, those Israeli pilots will have had plenty of practice. But if there is one lesson we gleaned about Iran and its proxies last year, it's this. Striking Iranian proxies is no substitute for attacking the regime itself. The regime must be deterred. So sure, the Houthis are a threat, but let's face facts. Bombing Yemen is not the answer. Iran is where this war began, and it's where this war must end. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Mossad chief David Barnea is reportedly in Qatar today for another round of hostage talks. Here's the latest. On Friday, a mid-level Israeli delegation held talks in Qatar. Then yesterday, an unnamed Palestinian source told a Qatari news outlet that Sunday would be a, quote, decisive day, end quote. The source claimed that gaps were bridged and that an Israeli decision was expected later Sunday evening after Netanyahu convened key ministers for a security meeting. But according to Israeli sources, there hasn't been a breakthrough yet. One Israeli source said the Qatari report was, quote, nonsense, end quote, and that Netanyahu summoned his ministers to discuss Lebanon, not the hostages. Evidently, hostage talks are still facing hurdles, including the number and names of hostages Hamas would release during the first phase of a future ceasefire. As we understand it, 34 hostages are on the list of those to be exchanged. That's 34 out of 100, folks. How that would be acceptable to Israel makes no sense to me. Headline 2, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz warned that the ceasefire in Lebanon may be hanging by a thread. During a visit to an IDF base in northern Israel, Katz said that Israel would be forced to act if Hezbollah doesn't withdraw from southern Lebanon as required by the 60-day ceasefire agreement signed in November. Under that agreement, Hezbollah is supposed to retreat north of the Litani River, and the IDF is expected to turn over its positions in South Lebanon to the Lebanese Armed Forces, also known as the LAF. Here's the thing. The ceasefire agreement is predicated on Hezbollah completely withdrawing from southern Lebanon and the Lebanese army dismantling Hezbollah's terror infrastructure in that area. That hasn't happened yet, not by a long shot. So if things stay as they are, Israel will have to act independently to secure the northern front. According to IDF spokesman Nadav Shoshani, there just aren't enough Lebanese troops ready to take over. That's why Israeli soldiers are still stationed in dozens of towns across southern Lebanon, and that's likely where they're going to remain. And headline 3, a delegation of Syrian ministers was in Qatar this weekend. Al-Qaeda in Qatar, who would have guessed, right? Syria's interim foreign minister was there, so were the interim defense minister and head of intelligence. They met with senior Qatari officials in Doha, including Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. Qatar is now one of the regime's top patrons, along with Turkey, and everyone is talking about how this new regime, led by al-Qaeda figures, is pragmatic, maybe even moderate. And I'm not buying it, not for a second. There's a lot of talk right now about U.S. sanctions, perhaps unraveling them. Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shibani reportedly told Qatari officials that the sanctions are standing in the way of Syria's economic recovery, and he urged Washington to lift them once and for all. After leaving Qatar, Shibani is planning to travel to Jordan and to the UAE to continue the new Syrian government's charm offensive. My sincere hope is that the Biden administration punts on the question of unwinding sanctions and leaves the decision to Trump. I'm not saying that Trump will necessarily get this right. It's complicated, but the new leaders of Syria need to do more to prove their peaceful intentions over more than just a few short weeks. Okay, it's now time for my conversation with Professor Ken Stein. I'm proud to call Ken a friend and a mentor, although if you ask him whether he ever thought I would make it in this business, you'll get a good belly laugh out of him. Ken taught at Emory for decades. Today, he's the president of the Center on Israel Education, or CIE, a terrific organization that I suggest you check out. He has been all over the news in recent days in the wake of the death of former President Jimmy Carter. That's because Ken worked with the former president for decades before the two parted ways, not so amicably, in 2006. It wasn't pretty, but it was pretty eye-opening to me. So let's bring Ken on the program right now to discuss the legacy of Jimmy Carter right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the program, Professor Ken Stein.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Great to have you. All right, well, let's start with Carter, the candidate. Carter the president, Carter the peacemaker. He was, after all, a peanut farmer who went on to forge Israel's first peace deal with an Arab country. I'm referring, of course, to Egypt. So what did Carter get right, and what did he get wrong?
I think Carter came out of South Georgia like most governors who become president without knowledge of foreign affairs or a lot of knowledge. I think Carter was much more prepared coming out of South Georgia to be a post-president than he was to be a president. I think his values, which he cultivated as a child and growing up and returning to become a peanut farmer, he took with him. I think he had acquired the knowledge of politics, give and take, carrots and sticks, negotiations, as he moved forward. Inherent in Jimmy Carter's personality is the desire to bring people together, regardless of the distances they have between them. He fit very well then into a position to bring Begin and Sadat together. And finally, I think Hamilton Jordan, in his interviews at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, in a very lengthy interview, which I recommend everyone to read because it's highly candid about the Carter administration. Hamilton says, we came to office, we knew very little about national politics. We had to learn very quickly. We had to capture the electoral votes in the 76 election. We couldn't have done it without 2 or 3 key people. And it's important to state that Carter was able in that election to garner 70% of the Jewish vote. He did not garner more than 40% in the 1980 election. And he attributed a little bit of his losses, or a great deal of his loss, in 1980 to the abandonment of the American Jewish electorate.
And that, I guess, began to influence how he addressed his post-presidency. We'll deal with that in a minute. But so Carter only serves one term. He loses to Ronald Reagan and he leaves office in 1980, then goes on to create the Carter Center. And you helped him. So what was the goal of creating this institution?
To give him a voice, a podium, a place. That was the initial goal. I don't think anyone who was part of the Carter Center staff in 81 or 82, the very few numbers of us and very few professors who participated in shaping the center's outlook or skeleton shape, understood that this was going to be a worldwide humanitarian effort 40 years later. I think Carter basically, having been crushed, literally crushed by the Reagan defeat, and I can't overstate that, because all during the Reagan administration, Carter was relentless in his criticism of Reagan as his successor. And he, in his post-presidency, he found this as an opportunity to not only criticize Reagan and SDI and use of power and all sorts of use of force, but I think Carter wanted very much to show that he was equipped to continue what he couldn't finish, namely engaging in Middle East mediation. And he made every effort to persuade every successor president to give him a chance, a shot. I cannot tell you how many times we sat in the back of a limousine and he would actually say, if they'd only give me a chance again, I could do it. And my response was, Sadat is not Arafat, and Sinai is not the West Bank. And he would just shrug his head.
Okay, well, so you work closely with the former president. Not many people can say that they did work with a former president so closely. So what did you learn about Carter up close that most of us would not have known about him?
He has a sneaky sense of humor. He is highly conscientious, industrious, has a mind that absorbs information extraordinarily quickly. You can give him a piece of information in January and in June in a meeting completely apart from anything you're believing. He takes that paragraph that you wrote 6 months later and he inserts it in the exact appropriate place. Carter never wanted to see a problem to go unresolved. And that was in part why he wanted to do mediation. He wanted to seek a comprehensive peace. And that's why he wanted to get involved in all sorts of aspects of humanitarian benefit, because he felt he could make things happen. And one of the latter parts of his life, he begins to embrace what I call the bad boys. He went off to North Korea. He never said no to a dictator. Why? Because Carter thought he could bring credibility to that person. That person would then use Carter as a vehicle to gain acknowledgement through the United States. And then Carter could be that link, that mediator who would make that connection, not only shape it, but have it develop. And I think he did that to the very end, even to the point in the early 2000s when he wholeheartedly and for a decade embraced Hamas as a political participant in negotiations with the Israelis.
Yeah, and we see those photos of him with Khalid Meshal and Ismail Haniya. I mean, really kind of jarring photos for a man who was who fashioned himself as a peacemaker in the region. So what's a good vignette, or maybe two, that you could share about your time with him while you were flying in the air on your way to the Middle East, or something that happened on the ground in the Middle East, or maybe even at a green room in a major television studio? I know you spent a lot of time with him around other world leaders and other important figures. So any specific vignettes pop out as we discuss his life?
Yeah, I just want to reach back to one point. Carter was not a person to allow establishments, elites, or previous history to get in the way of what he thought was the proper way to solve a problem. He didn't understand Middle Eastern leaders had this incredible commitment to their own nationalist ideology and they couldn't be compromised. Carter was willing to change history to fit his own needs. He
Hmm.
was willing to rewrite resolutions because he thought it was the right thing to do. So that I think it's important for someone to understand that Carter was committed to goals and didn't want anything to be in his way. No obstacles, no verbal, no historical, no ideological, no obstacles.
Hmm.
Vignettes. There are a couple. The one that stands out would be in the meeting with Hafiz al-Assad in March of 1987, finishing a meeting, a 2.5-hour meeting with Assad, standing in front of a picture, which is the picture of the Battle of Hittin of 1187. And Carter's standing next to Assad, and I'm standing next to Carter. And Assad is explaining it in Arabic, and I'm whispering in Carter's ear in English. This is the Battle of Hittin. This is the battle where the Crusaders lost to the Muslims. And so Carter nods, he nods, and then he finally says to Assad before the translator can say it, I think this is the Battle of Hittin where the Crusaders lost to the Muslims. And Assad picks up his finger and he waves it. He said, no, Mr. President. This is where the Arabs defeated the West. And I felt about 3 inches tall. And in that lesson was what we know about Hafiz al-Assad, the president. He was not defending the Muslim world. He was defending the Arab world. Hmm. And that was an idea which he carried with him all during his period as president. I think a second vignette would have been a more sentimental one. Leaving Lebanese airspace in 1983 after we'd been on our first trip to the Middle East, heading to Morocco. At 20,000 feet, he asks the steward to set up the table for dinner. The steward brings out 4 glasses for wine. Mrs. Carter, President Carter, his very faithful secretary, Faye Dill, and I are sitting there. And then the steward brings out a challah, and then the steward brings out 2 candles. And he turns to me and he says, I know you don't have a kippah, but will you say the Friday night blessing at 25,000 feet? Hmm. Now, the question that I always get from many people, was he an anti-Semite? And the answer has to be, he disliked Israeli policies. He absolutely disliked Israeli policies because it prevented his ability from fulfilling his dream of seeing a Palestinian state and self-determination for the Palestinians. That's what he thought he should do, because he was the person who should give the Palestinians a voice. He should represent their agency. Hmm. But Carter also, in his Palestine Peace Not Apartheid book, was viciously angry, and I choose the word viciously appropriately, angry at Israelis, and he actually advocated that terrorism should not stop until the Israelis accepted a roadmap for peace. Hmm. And that caused 12 members of the Carter Center board to resign, because he was actually advocating the killing of Jews. Now, I'm not certain he understood that. I'm not sure the copy editor of the book understood it, but he claimed for months afterward he wrote every word of the book. And that's why I broke. I mean, I could disagree with him. I could try and shape his editorial writings, but advisors only advise. We don't have the ability to actually change a point of view if a person has a very strong point of view. He did acknowledge, he said, you did at times bend my vocabulary. You did at times make me consider that I have to be more moderate in some tones. In 1994, I began to drift away from him, stayed on at the Carter Center, and from 95 forward, he takes more of a view of he's going around the world to make a difference and make change. He's not going to have these big meetings anymore in Atlanta, and he doesn't have his fellows that he has who are in academics, who are in the social studies of the world. He wants people who are doers, and it's to Carter's credit that he goes off and he does healthcare. And it's to my successor's credit as executive director, Bill Foege, that the center becomes a central place for eradicating disease and doing humanitarian good. And it's Bill Foege who deserves an incredible amount of credit for the direction in which the Carter Center headed and where it is now.
But you had your falling out. And so you talk about how you began to drift in the 1990s, but 2006 is the full rupture. If you would, just a couple of minutes about what happened there and where you left things.
Carter used to come regularly to my class in the early 80s. He would, I don't know if he actually spoke in a class that you attended, John, but he would talk about Iran. He would talk about the peace process. He would talk about Begin and Sadat. He used to come once or twice a year. The students loved it, and they grilled him because I had prepared the students in the class prior to give Carter a hard time with questions, and he relished it. He relished it. Carter was always interested in finding a resolution to the conflict. And I think he wrote his book because he felt people were forgetting that there was this issue out there that needed attention. When he came to my class in October of 2006, he actually said to me, he said, "I've written another book on the Middle East, only this time I'm not going to let you read the chapters beforehand." Now, we had written a book in 1984 called The Blood of Abraham. We played ping pong with the chapters back and forth. He said, "I'm not going to let you read it." And I didn't pay any attention to it until I went to Powell's bookshop in Portland. My wife and I were there, and I sat there for 2.5 hours and I read the book and read portions of it. I looked at some of the notes I'd taken at the meetings that he had with Assad in 1990, and looked at the notes in my computer, and I looked at the notes in the book, and I said, wow, what a difference. He's completely changed who's responsible for what. And then I read UN Resolution 242, which he put in the back of the book, and he said UN resolution doesn't call for withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories. He said 242 mandates Israeli withdrawals, requires Israeli withdrawals. Now, here again was Carter trying to rewrite a document in history because he wanted it to be his way. Why? If he didn't have Israeli withdrawal from territories, he couldn't push forward the idea of a Palestinian state and Palestinian self-determination. And that was absolutely critical for him. So his book, even though he criticized Israel and many things, and there were many things that Israel deserved to be criticized on, he wanted to hammer home the reality that Israel is the obstacle to reaching a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians. Did he ever criticize Arafat? No. Did he ever criticize Bashar Assad? No. Why? He didn't want to criticize those individuals with whom he could have contact and bring them in from the cold and credibly say, I'm the person who can be the mediator between that person or that person's ideology and Washington. Carter always had in mind what he wanted to do, even in 2006, which was 4 years after he got the Nobel Prize, which he earned. I think he was hurt that he didn't get the Nobel Prize in 78 with Begin and Sadat, but he got the Nobel Prize for his humanitarian work. Carter felt he did as much as Begin and Sadat for the peace process, and he wasn't recognized by the Nobel Committee because of it.
Well, sounds like he had some unfinished business, and fascinating as always. Ken Stein, thank you for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure, John. It's always good to see you and best to your family.
All right. You don't often hear from folks that know a former president for as long as Ken did, and well, always interesting. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Craig Singleton has a new piece in Foreign Policy reflecting on what was a rough year for Chinese President Xi Jinping. In addition to mounting internal challenges, the incoming Trump administration threatens to disrupt Beijing's strategic goals. Together, these factors point to a turbulent year ahead for the CCP, throwing a wrench in Xi's grand vision. Sorry, not sorry. Check out my colleague Ahmed Sharawi's piece in FDD's Long War Journal profiling 13 members of a new Syrian army under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. The FDD team is closely monitoring these figures and their influence on Syria's future. Remember, this new regime is cut from the same cloth as al-Qaeda. FDD's Aaron Gorin and Enya Kravin have penned a piece on the urgent need to address the escalating threat posed by the Houthis in Yemen. They argue that if Riyadh were to normalize relations with Jerusalem, it might be an important political step in the effort to blunt this ongoing Iran-backed aggression. And a new flash brief from FDD's rapid response team is gaining traction. It reveals that China is arming the Houthis in exchange for unimpeded Red Sea passage. Just remember, folks, there's an axis of aggressors out there. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working together. My question, who's working together on our side? And that's a wrap for the first morning brief of the year. If you're hungry for more, just read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels, and feel free to make that tax-deductible donation early this year at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. More news, more analysis, more smart people taking us behind the headlines. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.